Welcome to the DRF Sports Podcast, brought to you by DRF Sports. America's most trusted name in horse racing is now providing sports bettors with exclusive data, analytics, previews, videos, and expert picks on all major sports. Bet smarter and have more fun doing it. It's the DRF Sports Podcast, and now your host, Sheldon Alexander. Ready, set, bet.
This is the DRF Sports Podcast, episode 44. Make sure you like and follow wherever you get your podcasts. I'm your host, Sheldon Alexander, still recovering from maybe the best weekend of football that I can remember. The games are on fire, and so are we here on the pod after a 3-1 divisional weekend, bringing us to 8-2 overall in the playoffs. And that's before we add in so many prop wins and teaser wins. We'll recap all of that, of course. But first, be a pro and win with DRF Sports Pro, introducing DRF Sports' all-new premium data feature on drf.com/sports. For $99 a year, which is just $8.25 a month, you can get industry-leading betting trends, angles, and analytics. With the playoffs here, it's the best way for you to make some money this postseason and have some fun while doing it. DRF Sports Pro, sign up now at drf.com/sports. And hopefully we keep up with our pro picks here on the pod. We do this twice a week. On Tuesdays, we recap the week that was. And on Fridays, it's the picks pod. And, obviously, we're going to recap this wild weekend, talk about all of the wins that we got. Of course, as mentioned, things have been riding high for us here at the DRF Sports Pod. And to break it all down, my guy Matt Russell is here to do that, as well as give us an early look at what the projected lines could be for next weekend. And that starts right about now. Still riding high after a 3-1 divisional round, bringing the total to 8-2. This is why I love this podcast. My guy Matt Russell helping me out, helping my picks make sense, hopefully winning the people some money as well, because we didn't even mention the props are still cooking. The teaser legs have been cooking. We're just red hot here on the DRF podcast. Thanks in part to my dude, Mr. Matt Russell. Thank you for passing through. How are you after, I know last week was super wild card weekend,
right?
But this was super wild this past weekend, no?
That's right. Yeah, we've saved the super for another day, right? Man, I'm glad that we did this on Tuesday. You and I used to do this show on a Monday morning. Man, I don't know if we'd be able to put words together if we were doing this on Monday morning. We let everybody else kind of swoop in and give their takes about these games. So hopefully we don't do too much, repeating of the takes, if you will. Man, I needed a full 24 hours to kind of move past. I've not even really moved past, really just get, come up for air after those games. I'm going to watch those games over again in the condensed version. Shout out NFL Game Pass. Game Pass, excuse me. I'm going to watch those again today. I'm looking forward to doing that while I do a little work here. Man, incredible stuff. And obviously, really, outstanding week of betting. And, if anything, maybe my advice of, just watch the Kansas City Buffalo game. You don't need necessarily a side in that game. Yeah. Obviously, we had the teaser leg in that game, which was an excellent strategy just from a viewing standpoint, right? Obviously, a minus 270 price teaser leg is nothing to necessarily brag about. Just the idea that you could sit back and be like, there was maybe a couple of minutes where you were worried that Kansas City might, they had a 9-point lead. Maybe they're going to stretch it out. But, listen, the Bills were cooking on offense, Josh Allen, et cetera, that you just kind of knew, okay, this thing's coming down to the wire. So you weren't too worried about that. And you got to just kind of enjoy it from a pure football standpoint. And I think that was the really exciting thing about this past weekend is we got to just enjoy football for the sake of football. We didn't have a ton of referee malfeasance in there, right? And we just remember football at its finest is so good. And I think we're going to talk about that a lot today, going through some of these games from this past weekend.
Yeah, it was amazing, right? And, the people that might be brand new to the pod now, it's I come on here, I try to do this thing where I pick every single game that's going on, and Matt will help me out and talk me out of or talk me into, in a lot of instances, a lot of different games, which has been super fun, obviously, this playoffs, because, like you say all the time, That's what the money's for. And there's been money being made, which is great. So hopefully I had one of our boys come up to me at work yesterday and he was like, sorry, man, I went against you guys this weekend and it cost me. So I was like, it's okay, man. It's all right. There's still more games. Right? I don't even know where to begin, but I think we should go in reverse order in terms of how these games just happened, just because obviously that Bills-Chiefs game, 42-36, the win there in overtime, just complete insanity. And you mentioned not necessarily having a side. I was on the side of the Buffalo Bills. That line moved to plus 2.5 right before game time. And I don't know how many times I've sat and watched a game thinking I won a bet, lost a bet, won a bet, lost a bet that many times in I don't know, a 10-minute window. That was pure insanity. How did you enjoy, I'm going to say enjoy because clearly you didn't dread it, that just ending of that game? Because it was just complete chaos. What are we calling this game, by the way? I don't know. I don't even know.
I think it's called 13 seconds. I think it's just, you just say 13 seconds and everybody in the NFL is going to know, right? Just 13 seconds. You don't have to get any more elaborate than that, I don't think. And listen, I was cheering for the Bills in sort of that purist type of a form, but I had also talked about on a Twitter space, a couple of weeks ago before the playoffs started, I was pretty deep into the weeds from a Bills playoff prop standpoint. I had Josh Allen most yards for the playoffs. I had Stephon Diggs most receiving yards for the playoffs, which obviously, as that game's playing out, you're going, well, Stephon Diggs not doing anything here, so that prop is out of things. But the one that I liked the most was the Bills' most points for the playoffs, because it was actually priced better than the Bills to win the Super Bowl. And I'm like, the Bills don't even have to win the Super Bowl to have the most points, right? Think if they win that game, however you want to frame it, maybe they're the team that gets 42 points. Maybe they had, obviously we'll talk about that 13 seconds. But, maybe you're the team that wins that game with 36 points, and obviously the big showing against the Patriots the week before. And just go, okay, we're just going to have to file that one, in the sort of cylindrical file of really, really good bet, really smart, really well thought out bet to try to get as much, an advantage as much as we can on the sports books, right? Where it's like, hey, if you're going to offer me 10-1 on Bills to win the Super Bowl, but if you're going to offer me 12-1 that they're going to have the most points in the playoffs, I find it hard to believe that they're going to win the Super Bowl and not score the most points, for throughout the playoffs. And so you just go, really good bet, didn't work out. And so, not to say that I didn't bet that game, obviously I did from sort of a previous standpoint, but the basic, principle of that bet was, I think it's going to be a 50-50 game when and if they play Kansas City. And there was nothing from last night's or 2 nights ago's game that would indicate that game was anything other than a 50-50 game, right? And so you just go, okay, logic, everything, all of that sort of stuff. That all worked out. Didn't happen to work out on the field because that last 13 seconds was obviously the difference. And listen, I don't know about you, man, but when they get that field goal, and we'll talk about sort of the sequencing up into that point, but I knew the Bills weren't going to win the coin toss, and I knew when they didn't win the coin toss, I knew they weren't going, the Chiefs are going to get the ball for a touchdown, and that the Bills weren't going to get the football back, right? You just felt that. Yeah. And you felt your heart sink because even, again, modest amounts of money, if you will, on those Bills props, you still just go, man, I actually kind of felt like a fan of the team for a second there. And really, I'm not a fan of anybody. That sort of died inside me a long time ago. But it was weird sort of having these sort of flashbacks that, there was a little bit of financial implications, but it was really more just man, it would be really crushing if the Bills lost this game. And, you could tell, they talk about the Andy Reid quote at the end, right? If when it looks grim, be the grim reaper or whatever. That's the quote of a guy who's playing with house money, right? That's the guy who's just kind of chill on the sideline is well, we're probably not going to win this game, but let's say a cool line to my quarterback and see what happens. And then of course we saw what happened, but it's I don't think Sean McDermott's coming up with that line because it meant so much more. As weird as it is to say for a game that is, a lot of people think, and I'm hard to disagree, that this was kind of a de facto Super Bowl. It's really, it's it's just kind of really brutal for a Bills team that wanted it a lot more. And then it's weird to say that like maybe the Chiefs would have been okay with it. It wasn't going to set the franchise back if they lost that game, where you sometimes wonder whether it might do that to the Bills, as sort of rough as that sounds.
Yeah, and you mentioned, right, like from a gambling standpoint, for me, like the weekend and the playoffs have been going so well that, I mean, at that point, perfect on the weekend. So it's like the Bills losing that game, it's not like I'm picking that game because I had to pick that game, essentially, right? So the bet, but I'm saying like the bet, and I'm saying self-inflicted, I know. The bet, it was okay. It wasn't for anything crazy, but I'm looking at that saying, okay, 13 seconds left. Chances are you should win that game and win that bet, right?
That's right.
But I'm saying everything has been going so well that I wasn't even really mad. And I was sitting like, I wasn't even really mad watching it go down, because I mentioned earlier on, one of my friends was like, betting against the Chiefs and betting against Tom Brady on Sunday, for me, personal pain. Like that hurt my feelings, right? Because those are dudes, we're separating the money from like the love of the football. And you know what I mean? Like I ride for Brady. I love cheering for the Chiefs, all that fun stuff. So sitting there, 13 seconds left, I'm looking at it. I'm like, they can't lose, can they? But at the same time, you're looking at Mahomes and you just watch Tyreek Hill bust off a long ass run in which he gives up the peace sign at like the 17-yard line, and there's a dude 2 yards ahead of him that could tackle him still. And it's just like, well, I guess anything is possible. And the Bills completely just coughed that one up, right? And from a gambling standpoint, I don't know what's worse when you're losing, how we joke about losing a 3.5 point cover in overtime. You know what I mean? If it was like plus 3.5 and you lose in overtime, that's crushing. I don't know. This has to be more crushing, right? 13 seconds left. You're about to cover cash. If you had Bills money line, if you had the Bills plus 2.5, and then boom, that one.
Well,
that's a tough one.
And honestly, God help me if that line hadn't at any point +3 for Buffalo, like in any sort of meaningful, like at a decent price.
No,
because I would have just absolutely housed Buffalo at +3, and I'd be sitting here and listen. You guys have been listening to this podcast for all season long, right? Like that we've had all 3 of those touchdown in overtime situations. We were on them pretty big on the underdog, right? And so that had been sort of the theme for sort of close but not quite as successful as this season was. And so I was just thinking to myself, man, like if Buffalo was +3, I'd have a really big bet on Buffalo and I would just be absolutely rattled right now. And like, I think of, I'm a big Seinfeld guy. And so I think of like, different scenes for Seinfeld as many, of our ilk do. And I think of like Jerry, there's one scene where he's like crying, and he's an emotionless robot, which I sort of feel like I am when it comes to betting in a lot of cases. And he's crying. He's like, what is this clear, salty discharge coming from my eyes? Because he's not used to being emotional about it. And I sort of do the math on like the money that I quote unquote lost from that, from those prop bets that I had made on the Bills. And I'm just like, this is not nearly enough for me to feel as sort of sad as I do for, again, a Bills team that I have no sort of emotional connection to. Not that I was like crying about it, but I was like, what is this like sorrow that I feel? Like, I don't understand this sadness that's not directly, but it's like, it's not directly, related to the money that I've bet on this game, because the money that I bet was not nearly enough for me to feel as bad as I did. And I was like, oh, is this empathy? Am I feeling sympathetic to the Bills? Like, what is that feeling? Like, I don't understand. So, I mean, when, they score at 13 seconds left, and, listen, my partner, Emily, she was really pumped about watching that game. And, we high-fived on the touchdown for the Bills. And it was sort of this pure type thing. But, I thought to myself, because I'd said to her when Chiefs scored, I was like, the good news is with 3 timeouts, I think the Bills had. It's like with 3 timeouts and a minute left, like that's a ton of time for the Bills to come back. And she's like, oh, okay. Like, she didn't really know. It's late in the game. Like she's, figures that's probably it. And so when the Bills score, I go 13 seconds and I was like, well, that actually might still be enough time for a field goal.
But against any other team, it is. Any other team.
And it just shows like how much like, having timeouts like matters in the NFL, right? And you can do the math right away. It's sort of like, okay, 2 plays. And listen, it's been sort of beaten to death here, obviously, about like, okay, you got a mortar kick, or, people say squib kick or whatever. I think mortar kick is more the sort of newer term as far as like you want to kick it in the air and have it land on the 1, 2, 3, 4 yard line, right? You don't want that ball to land on the end zone. And then, of course, the old John Harbaugh, tackle everybody at the line of scrimmage, and you're going to get called for an offensive holding call, but it's going to take 5 seconds off the clock. And so, you do the math there, and you go 3 or 4 seconds on a kickoff and 4 or 5 seconds on an offensive play where you tackle everybody at the line of scrimmage. It's like, well, now you're looking at 4 seconds from the 25 to 30 yard line for the Chiefs. And like, yeah, they're going to kneel the ball at that point. Like, you can say Hail Mary or whatever, but the game, they're not going to kneel the ball, obviously, because they have to go for the tie, excuse me. But like,
I know what you're saying.
They're not going to kneel the ball. They're going to have to throw the ball down the field. And so it's like a situation where it's like, okay, they got 70 yards to go here, because obviously they're not going to be able to run the field goal team on the field. And so you're looking at a Hail Mary situation. And so you just go, as much as like Josh Allen was amazing and like you want to blame like the OT rules, I'm not really all that here for blaming the OT rules. We know what the rules are. Listen, if anybody was looking to blame the OT rules, like that would be me through the 3 games that we lost on plus 3.5 in overtime. And so I just look at it and I'm like, honestly, you just screwed up the 13 seconds. And we'll talk about some of these other games and these other teams as far as like closing time. And like this one was like the tiniest amount of closing time. Like you just had to just close for 13 seconds and they just couldn't do it. And like, as much as I want to feel bad and whatever for the Bills, I just have to kind of go like, you really screwed that 13 seconds up. It didn't need to be that way.
You mentioned the Harbaugh and trying to take the defensive penalty, right? And that would just lead to running time off the clock. How many coaches do you think would have actually employed that? Like how many dudes, like Belichick's probably sitting at home watching that, Vrabel maybe sitting at home watching that, being like, there's no way I'm letting these guys have a chance to get those 2 plays off with 13 seconds left. Like I'm coming out with all the tricks out of my back pocket to just run the time off, right? Like I feel like Vrabel, right? Vrabel would be one of those dudes that would have something like that as well.
Yeah, you would think anybody in sort of the Belichick tree necessarily, but I don't remember an instance where Belichick did that. And so like for those who are sort of uninitiated, right? The John Harbaugh thing this was years ago. And this is actually at the end of the first half, if I'm not mistaken, but it might've been the end of the game. But like at the end of the first half, you can do the same thing where it's like you get down into a goal to go situation and there's, 15 seconds left. And it's like, the other team is probably just going to settle for the field goal. So why let them run plays from, say, like the 5 yard line, knowing that they're going to settle for a field goal with like 3 seconds left in the second quarter? Obviously, that's a little bit different in, at the end of a game, because they're not just going to kick a field goal down 7. A little bit different as far as just, only giving them 1 play. But it's like, tackle all the receivers, take the penalty, half the distance to the goal or 5 yards or whatever. But the time comes off the clock. And so, I imagine Belichick knows that rule, because this happened like 5, 6 something years ago when Harbaugh did this. And they didn't really institute any rule to, dissuade anybody from doing it. And so, we've seen Vrabel use some of Belichick's tricks, and obviously Belichick has all the tricks. And then beyond that, like, I don't know that anybody else other than obviously John Harbaugh hadn't done it before, again, and that's the thing that frustrates me when it comes to coaching and people who talk about some of these other coaches. And I'm not going to say his name. I'm not going to do it. We're not getting, we're not getting drunk in the first, this early in the morning for those of you looking to play the drinking game. But like anytime a smart coach who seems to have an understanding of how rules and how probabilities and sort of the ins and outs, right? We sort of talk about the dark areas of winning football games. Anytime one of those guys comes into the league and maybe things don't necessarily go that well for him, that's what bums me out, because we end up with the guys like the Mike McCarthy's of the world who end up, just know they don't know the rules. They don't even know the basics, right? This guy's running a draw play. Everybody talking about how the draw play took longer than the 13 seconds that it took, the Chiefs to score a field goal, in that game. And so I just kind of go like, I don't know. I wish, we give credit. We sort of say good coach, bad coach, right? And it's some sort of black and white type of thing where it's like, No, it's really just like, okay, this coach excels at, motivation. This, this coach excels at game planning. This coach excels at in-game decision-making and knowing the rule book and all of that and all of those sort of things. And so like, we'll talk obviously about Tennessee and Cincinnati, but it's like, we already have given Vrabel this credit for knowing the rules in and out. And he was doing excellent work as far as using his timeouts at the end of the first half. And you go like, that's a guy who gets it. But like, maybe some other stuff slipped along the way, right? Exactly. And so like none of these coaches are perfect. And I'm willing to kind of give a lot of these coaches a pass for maybe a wrong decision here or there, because nobody's going to play the perfect game. Nobody's going to coach the perfect game. But it's, situations like that where we're, especially with the kickoff, like somebody, whether it's the kicker, the special teams coach, or the head coach, like somebody has to know the situation. And I kind of understand maybe the coach because he's got a lot going on. Like, what's the special teams coach doing in that situation? Yeah. Obviously, we have an whole other special teams issue from earlier on in the week, but like that's pretty egregious too. That he doesn't say like, listen, my only job here is field goal kicking, blocking, defense, field goal defense, kick return stuff. Like you should know when it comes to your guys and your time to shine, if you will, what the best process is, right? Like you should have all of these different
the clock's your friend
at your arsenal. Yeah, well, of course. And so like, how the special teams coach isn't just like, hey man, like 13 seconds, like, do you want to go with the mortar kick here? Do you want to kick this ball short of the end zone to take some time off the clock? Now, maybe the answer to that is like, we don't really want to deal with McCole Hardman, or like we're obviously the big, punt return from Tyreek Hill. Maybe they're sort of gun shy as far as that was concerned. They figured, hey, like if we get organized here defensively, we probably have a better chance of stopping them than what might actually happen on the kick return. I don't know, right? Like that, you get into sort of probabilities and mathematics with that too. But like, I don't even know if those apply, because obviously with a guy like McCole Hardman back there, he cracks one, 40 yards or whatever. And now you feel like kind of an idiot, but like, it's going to take time for him to crack one 40 or 50 yards, right? Like that's kind of the point that you're mentioning with regards to like, listen, like it's the clock is your friend, man. Make them take some time off that clock.
Just a wild, wild game from all corners. A great way to wrap up an exceptional weekend. And again, like the weekend was so good. I enjoyed that game so much. I wasn't even that mad at the loss. And that was the lone loss against the spread. You hit a bunch of different props and the teasers, which again, we like talking about because you keep saying, well, nothing to brag about, but it's money made. Right?
Yeah.
And a lot of people are listening to find those things out. There's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah.
There's nothing wrong with
that game. Thanks. And that game gets crazy because Tyreek Hill goes over, right? And Josh Allen over that we talked about on the show. We actually hit a couple of plus 300s. We had, we're the geniuses who had Gabe Davis plus 300 to score a touchdown. We are the idiots who didn't take him to score 2+ touchdowns or 3+ touchdowns at outrageous numbers, right? Like everything, it all kind of comes back to we could have done a little bit better. Obviously, McCole Hardman scoring a touchdown as well at plus 300, couple of touchdowns that we didn't necessarily get there, but when you're plus 300 on 2 touchdowns and get the overs on some of those yardages, right, you can sort of forgive the idea that like the long shot touchdown guy doesn't score or something like that. All in all, a really good game to watch, a decent game to bet, and just kind of a bummer of a game if you were looking for the Bills to sort of turn the tide in the AFC a little bit here. But sign me up right now for betting the Bills in the rematch next year. Whether it's in Kansas City, I imagine maybe the schedule makers throw them a bone and put one of these in Buffalo next year. But I'm in for whatever price they want to give me on the Bills next year in that regular season matchup. Playoffs, might be a different situation, but certainly in the regular season. Remind me, everybody out there, hit me up. Remind me to grab the Bills next year in this matchup.
That's just a crushing loss for the Bills. But hey, we keep things moving, and there was the Rams who almost had a crushing loss of their own, but just hung on to win against the Bucs 30-27. And we end up cashing on this one as the Rams were 3-point underdogs in this game, and they win outright. You mentioned the late move. There's a lot of movement on a lot of these games right before game time, which I found super weird. But as you mentioned, it's been a theme the whole entire time. I want to ask you this. I'm going to start here. I had the bet on the Rams +3. Yeah. I'm not going to lie to you. I was working while this game was going on. So I'm watching. I'm like in it. But there was a point where I got a little focused on work and the game's on in the background. And I'm like, okay, yeah. I'm seeing what's going on.
Yeah.
But at no point was I actually like worried until like the like real fumble started going down. And you talked about Cam Akers and like, we're just going to throw this guy all the way back in as if everything's cool. But what a game. What a game. Were you worried about the cover at any point there?
Well, this is the universe of the better, right? And so we talked about how, listen, I'm not a big totals guy, right? It's often a disaster when I start betting totals, but it's actually gone okay in the very minimal selective way that I've been betting totals this season, right? I think I bet 7 totals during the regular season. Then we were on the Patriots and the Bills game in that first round. And then this one was another one where I was like, okay, I'm on the over, waiting to see if we can get that +3 at like as close to kind of a -110 as we possibly could. And you mentioned the line, the late moves just getting absolutely crumbled this season in the playoffs, where if you're fading that late move, like in a lot of cases we are either intentionally or unintentionally, you're doing really well. And so I end up making a late bet because I was waiting on that +3. And so that ends up looking like it's going to win comfortably. And then I'm just sitting there going like, all right, we need Tampa Bay here to chip in when it comes to getting this over the total. And everything we know about Tom Brady is that like they're going to keep, they're going to try to score. They're probably going to score late or whatever. And it's funny, you mentioned like real fumble. It's like the first one was like, the Akers one was like a fake fumble. I mean, it was clearly a fumble, but it was a shrug your shoulders, right? You're like, oh, that's not gonna cost the Rams. Like they're up 20-3 at halftime. Like they're dominating. Tom Brady looks like he can't do anything out there. And I'm sitting there with my over 48 going like, man, I really could have used that touchdown at the end of the half, right? Like that would really set me up nice here. Instead, we're 23 points. We need 26 to get over the total in the second half. I don't know. And the Rams come out and they score that touchdown early on. And you mentioned sort of having to work, and I was like, I'm going to get a little. I referenced the Pelly 22 straight days, no big deal. Or sorry, 25 straight days, no big deal. I'm like, I'll get a little Pell in. I'm going to get a little Pell in at halftime into the third quarter, and we'll sort of see if this turns into a blowout. And they scored that touchdown. I'm like, okay, shower up and we'll watch the rest of the third quarter. And I come, out of the shower, I'm like looking at the game, and like the Bucks have the ball back. And I'm like, oh, okay. And I, a quick little rewind and find out that Cooper Kupp has fumbled. And I'm like, okay, we are now up to 2 fumbles. And I'm sitting there like going, okay, we need to sort of have the Bucks catch up here to get the total over. But as this game progresses and Tampa Bay scores again, and I'm like, oh man, now we're in a 27-20 spot here where it's like, mind of the sports better, you go, okay, well, if the Bucks tie the game here, that cashes the over because your guy, Matt Gay, can't make a 47-yard field. Like I'm watching that 47-yard field goal and I'm like, okay, that's going to seal it up, right? That's going to seal up the Rams, 2-score game, blah, 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 blah. I guess it would have been a 3-score game at the time. And I'm like, okay, and that's going to push this thing over, or it's going to push it over. And again, I'm sort of conflating how what the order of operations were, but it was like, I just need one more touchdown from the Bucks, and I need a field goal from the Rams. Right? I need 10 more points here for that everything wins, and I don't have to worry about overtime or anything like that. And they score the touchdown. I'm like, okay, I guess overtime is fine. Like I'll take my chances. As I can't, sort of a bird in the hand sort of situation. I'm like, okay, we'll take my chances here with the over. But it would have been really nice if Matt Gay had just been able to kick the ball 48 yards, which apparently a professional kicker in pristine conditions, there's no guarantee of that happening. Like it never occurred to me that ball was going to land short. Sorry.
I actually thought that was good. Like as I said, I'm watching, I'm paying attention, and I see the kick, and I'm like, oh, okay, good. Wait a second, that missed? I was like, hold on, what's happening here? Yeah,
like I'm very sort of, because I have a running joke again with my partner Emily. She's really bad at sort of figuring out whether it went in or not, right, on field goals.
Yeah.
And I should mention the field goals. And so I'm watching, and I always sort of try to teach. I try to teach her. Oh man, we're off the rails. I try to sort of teach her about like whether you see the ball when it crosses the bar, right? Because that's where it kind of gets confusing. And I'm like, I had to like triple take that. Like I'm like, wait a minute, I didn't see the ball cross over the bar. And then of course the referees are like waving it as no good. I was like, what? Like it's not even possible. And so I made some quips on the old bird about, the idea that like if the Bucks come back here, like Tom Brady is going to get all this credit, right? And then I just look at like his stats here, and I'm like, okay, my guys had 54 attempts and only 329 yards. And obviously the throw to Mike Evans was sort of like the masterpiece, if you will, of that. But it's like 1 touchdown and 1 interception. Like, this isn't Tom Brady making the comeback. This is the Rams just systematically blowing it here, right? Whether it's the first fumble, right? Any one of those 4 fumbles, obviously the last fumble being the most obvious, any one of those 4 fumbles don't happen. And the Rams win this game, comfortably or, relatively comfortably. If that kick goes through the uprights, that gets made, like, what percentage of the time? Like, maybe not a 47-yarder getting made, but a 47-yarder that's online gets made, like, a lot of the time. And, like, if any of that happens, we don't even consider the idea that, like, Brady's done it again, right? And so I just kind of get a little worked up about this, like, the branding concept, right? Of, like, well, this team, because of the jerseys that they wear, have no chance of losing. Or the team, because of the quarterback that they have on the team, have no chance of losing, as if odds makers aren't fully aware of who the quarterback is, right? They are fully aware that Tom Brady's the quarterback, and yet that line was for much of the week under a field goal. It goes up, touches 3 before the game time. But like, we talked about this, like the line during the regular season, that would have been 3.5. Right. But because of the situation with obviously the offensive line woes when it comes to Brady, and listen, he was excellent as far as like not getting sacked on every single play. Right. He's avoiding Von Miller back there. And, we actually got, I don't want to say sort of screwed over, but like the Gronkowski prop, I still think that was a pretty good bet. Right. But Tom Brady's out there tap dancing Von Miller on 2 plays that ended up being 70 yards on 2 plays for Gronk, who by and large had to stay in and block exactly like how we handicapped it. Right. And so you're watching that and going like, man, I feel pretty good about the way we handicapped that. And if it was just anybody, other than I guess Brady's ability to evade even sort of the best athletes in the world, we're going to cash that prop easily. But like, it wasn't Brady's best game. It wasn't even close to Brady's best game. And obviously this one, I look at it this way, like what's the biggest, Brady comeback ever, right? It's obviously the Falcons game in the Super Bowl. But like the Falcons that day, that one was more, okay, Brady's got 4 possessions and they need to score on like all 4 possessions that they have left after the game was 28-3, right? It's like the thin line there, right? And the Falcons had to let them back into it with a couple of mistakes, but like the 2 mistakes that the Falcons made were a strip sack on a fumble, which I believe it was Hightower who came in and made that play that day. But it's like they're allowed to make a good play on defense, right? Like you're allowed to sack a guy, right? And the other play obviously was getting sacked out of field goal range after that big completion to Julio Jones. And it's like, okay, the sack was pretty brutal, but like that's one sort of play that the Falcons screwed up. But the strip sack was a play that the Patriots made. We're watching the Rams out there fumble the football away, literally fumbling the football away, right? The Falcons, other than that strip sack, never fumbled the ball away to the Patriots. The Falcons that day never had a snap zip by Matt Ryan's ear and go 25 yards behind when you're already in field goal range. Now, again, theoretical field goal range, because who knows what Matt Gay was capable of doing from any kind of a distance. But like, you get that strip sack on Brady, you're sitting there in field goal range, you're like, okay, well, this is going to be, for me, for the total, I'm doing the math, and I just want 3 more points for the Rams. But for the Rams, for the game, it's like, okay, we just need 3 more points, and they're zipping snaps, whistling by Matt Stafford. Like the Falcons didn't do that. The Falcons didn't have 4 fumbles on the game. They didn't have a 47-yarder come up short, right? Like, the Falcons at least, tried to play that as sort of best they could, whereas the Rams did everything they could not to. And I'm hearing a lot of like, oh, Sean McVay like really blew it in the second half and all that sort of thing. I'm like,
he doesn't fumble. He doesn't make bad snaps. That's not.
No, exactly. And it's like, you could, it's funny, like we critique the play calling, and there'll be another example of this, from earlier on in the weekend, but it's like, okay, like sometimes there's some really wacky play calling. Andy Reid's out there running an option with Blake Bell on 3rd and 1, right? But he gets away with it, and he's just this guy with the cool line to Mahomes at the end of the game, who's got a Super Bowl ring, who like doesn't care. But like 3rd and 1, you're running a Blake Bell option, like that's kind of the stupidest thing imaginable. Like I understand, like I don't mind critiquing that, but like just sort of this overall concept of like, you say, okay, well, Sean McVay, like, they turtled, right? But like, if they're still slinging the ball around with a 27-3, 27-6 lead with Matthew Stafford, who, again, like, polarizing guy, like, I think Matthew Stafford's a really, really good quarterback. Like, he could he could quarterback my team if I had one any day of the week. But like, I get why you wouldn't want him slinging the ball around and giving Tom Brady maybe not just 4 possessions, but 5 or 6 possessions with a turnover. Sean McVay doesn't know that that everybody's going to fumble or that the snap's going to go zipping by Matthew Stafford. Like, that seemed like a center issue and not necessarily a quarterback issue. My big complaint, as you mentioned, was having Cam Akers out there a lot, right? When you don't play for a full season, it's not that you're not fast. It's not that you can't hit the holes. Ball security is always an issue. It's why we see a lot of fumbles the first week of the NFL season, because these guys aren't used to the contact the way, they're used to practice contact. They're not used to landing on their head, right? They're not used to like desperation guys. Like, it didn't matter necessarily whether Akers got tackled or not. It mattered that to the Bucs to strip Akers, right? And that's not something that you get where you have those guys just going, first goal is strip the football. First goal is usually tackle. Right. And so I talked about how like goal line situations are to close the game. Like, they need to have a veteran out there like Sony Michel, and they didn't. So that's where I would sort of, from a personnel standpoint, chop McVay a little bit. But if he's out there throwing the ball around, we're sitting there going like, all you had to do was run the football like the rest of the game. Or like, we do the thing where it's like, if they just kneeled every play, like they could have won that game. And like, that's true. Because the end result was they fumbled the ball to the other team, like 3 different times in that second half. But it's like, that's not what he's expecting there. He's thinking that he's playing it conservative, that he's limiting Tom Brady's possessions and all of that sort of thing. Like, he's playing it with respect to the guy who's on the other side. And like, obviously the Rams are having success moving the ball through the air, but like, that can dry up pretty quick. We've seen that in, numerous games where just because what you're doing in the first half works doesn't necessarily make any sort of guarantee that it's going to happen in the second half. And so all's well that ends well when it comes to the Rams. Obviously, we don't have to beat it up, rehash the last play. Obviously, an outstanding throw, outstanding catch. How does Cooper Kupp get back there? All of that sort of thing, right? And they, able to spike the ball, kick the field goal, short enough field goal for Matt Gay to actually get it there. I'm going to be a little bit bitter. Even though everything worked out, I'm still going to be a little bit bitter about that one for a couple of days. Again, like, I rather beat up the coaches for some of the basic stuff that like just seems like you're unprepared, like you don't know when to use timeouts, you don't know how the clock or challenges or all of that sort of thing, stuff that you can drill in the off season when you can't force players to come to practice, and training camp in May, right? You can't force them to do that. But what you can do is you can watch games, you can watch late game situations, you can be ready for those situations. So when it comes to that stuff with coaching, like, that's the stuff that me on my couch is going to be able to say like, yeah, I would do this, or I would think that these guys should have a better handle on all this stuff. When you're up 3 touchdowns against Tom Brady, like, I don't know that there's a manual for that, right? Because it is, you shouldn't be slinging the ball around and risking interceptions. You would think that the conservative play is going to sort of win out in the end. And maybe that did just enough. And it certainly would have. Again, I'll reference the kicker again. If the kick gets made, nobody talks about like the conservatism of McVay in that situation, right? Like, the kick gets made and then they win by 10, they win by 3, something along those lines. And like, nobody beats up McVay, right? And so again, he could have easily have like kneeled it down there at the end of the game with Stafford and just taken it to overtime. But they're like, no, we're going to throw it here. We're going to try here. So again, and listen, there's a lot of stuff, especially when some of his conservative decisions that like I don't love about McVay, but when you're up 3 touchdowns, man, like, I just don't know what else you're supposed to do other than just go, you know what, let's have some real safe ball carriers out there so that we don't have this sort of thing happen.
Yeah, I mean, it's not like he ran a 0 blitz without all of his players knowing that it was a 0 blitz and not knowing the coverage with seconds left in the fourth quarter of a tie game, right? So it's all right. It's all right.
Yeah.
Let's keep things moving though, and let's go to the Niners and the Packers. This was a wild one on Saturday night. Saturday nights in the playoffs, right, always seem to be a little hectic, we'll say. Sure. Niners end up winning 13-10. This was a point spread that got all the way up to 6 points for the Packers. And No, we're going to talk that talk here because we sat here last week saying this is about a matchup. And I know how the game played out and it was about special teams and all that stuff happened. But to me, the key was that we talked about we've seen this before from Aaron Rodgers and the Packers in home games where it just doesn't go the way that everyone is going to say the point spread is that high because it's Aaron Rodgers. Everyone's going to bet on the Packers because it's Aaron Rodgers. And we sat here last week saying that's not the case. We've seen this go the other way for Aaron Rodgers and the Packers in the playoffs. So don't be afraid to take the Niners and the points. We even told you to sprinkle a little on the money line. I think that was
the rollover.
Exactly.
Yeah, forget sprinkle. We're all in, right? And we're all in on the 49ers, right? This isn't a sprinkle situation, right? Like,
this
fundamentally, right? When you talk about, I mean, like you talk about the Rodgers thing, and that's the issue, right? Because you can't look at the 49ers and be like, oh, they ran it down the Packers' throats, or like all of the, everybody loves that sort of line, right? Like if any team has a good run game, it's like, oh, they're going to run it down their throat. And it's like, well, they should probably just not play the game then, I guess. Like we'll talk about, the first game of the weekend being that, having that sort of narrative concept, right? And so it wasn't that. It was more just like, okay, Jimmy G isn't going to have to do necessarily a ton. I thought he was the best player on the team, certainly on the offense for the first half of that game, because he's hitting guys in stride and they can't catch a ball to save their life. Okay. So like he's, and I'm sitting there and he's 0 for 4. And we know, as you mentioned, right? Like the last show, like the last time they played, he threw the ball like 10 times. And I'm like, yeah, that's the game plan. Like the game plan is for him to probably throw this ball 10 times. And so his stats, I'm looking at it's 0 for 4, 0 yards. And I'm like, if there was ever something that was misleading, that would be that, right? Like George Kittle, I was very vocal about George Kittle not catching that pass on Twitter because, as we talked about, one of our prop bets was George Kittle over 19 and a half receiving yards on one play, right? His longest reception would be over 19 and a half. And so we were almost, so close to cashing that in the first quarter, but he drops that football. Obviously, you had Brandon Ayuk drop the football. Fortunately, he dropped it just enough that it wasn't a fumble. And then there was, I believe, was the Debo who had another drop, right? So of those 0 for 4, it was like all of those passes were directly into the hands of guys. And so instead of being 4 for 4 for like 65 yards, and maybe there's, at the very sort of least, there's a field goal drive in there. Obviously, if, Kittle had caught the ball, maybe it's maybe it ends up being a touchdown drive. Who knows? Maybe it's a touchdown on that play. And so I'm just looking at him like, he's going to end up like 8 for 17 or something in this game for like 65 yards, and people are going to beat up Jimmy. And listen, like he throws that interception late in the first half, and what I said, man. I was sitting there going like, Jimmy had to think. Right? Because someone sent
me the text message and they were like, Jimmy Garoppolo is a newscaster that can't go off the teleprompter. Like they have to read exactly what's on the teleprompter. If they got a freestyle, if they got a fill, hey, just fill, take us to break, 15 seconds. Yeah. Nope, it's not going to be able to do it. Can't do it.
Right.
Can't do it.
Right. And you and I have seen that firsthand. I'm yelling, Jimmy, Jimmy had to think, right? But like he's making the throws when he doesn't have to think. Unfortunately, it's so cold that these guys are just not used to being able to catch this ball that has, got to be absolutely just rock hard out there. And so I'm just sitting there looking at this going like, man, he is going to take absolute fire for this game because, of course, on the first drive, in the best conditions possible, Rodgers and company like go down the field. And we talked about a guy by the name of Ambry Thomas, who was the difference maker at corner this season, supplying the 49ers with that third corner, and a rookie out of Michigan. And he ends up being the surprise inactive on Saturday, or at least certainly a surprise to me. And I'm like, oh man, like a lot of my handicap for this game, including the Devontae Adams under, was based on this idea that they weren't going to have weaknesses in the secondary. Yeah. And then all of a sudden, Dante Johnson gets rolled out there, and Josh Norman makes
Josh Norman's music. Is that Josh Norman's music?
Yeah, I'm like, oh my God, right? And there was obviously a key play late in that game where it's like Josh Norman's one-on-one against Devontae Adams. And I'm like, oh, sweet Lord, like this can't be. Like, this is basically our nightmare, right? Like if you had injected that one play call from, had to have been Joe Buck, right? Yeah, one play call from Joe Buck into that podcast last week, right? Like that would have been hilarious where it's like, Josh Norman, hasn't been seen since. And it's like, and now Josh Norman's in man to man on Davante Adams. Like, what? Anyway,
but
Davante
how
Adams
perfect is it though? But think about how perfect that is that everybody knows exactly what's going to happen. Josh Norman checks in. They've designed this play that he ends up on Davante Adams. And we all know that he's going to throw it to Davante Adams. Everybody knows that. The one saving grace is at least Josh Norman is a vet. And so he probably knows this is going to happen, which is different than if he was a rookie and the rookie's like extra shook and like, oh no. Like that's the one maybe silver lining saving grace of that whole situation.
I'll say this too, right? Like when Josh Norman comes in and knows that he's like, okay, this is the one-on-one with Davante Adams, because Josh Norman has it in him, right? Like Josh Norman is that guy, or sort of, was that guy at some point, right? He's no longer that guy. And does that mean like it's all gone for Josh Norman? Or does that mean you just don't want Josh Norman out there for 60 snaps, right? Exactly. To me, it's like, all right, if you have one snap for your life to cover Davante Adams, like this is the one, right? And so he comes out and he's on the field for that snap, and like you said, like I'm sitting there going like, oh my God, this is brutal. But Shell, do you know how many snaps Josh Norman played in that game? Guess, like random guess.
I'm gonna say 3.
He played 2 snaps in that game. You went low.
I remember the 2. No.
And you couldn't go low enough.
2, and I'm like, there's got to be one more that I just missed, right?
Yeah. Well, so Mosley plays 100% of the snaps. K'Wan Williams plays 75% of the snaps. And Dante Johnson, who had played 10% of the snaps against the Cowboys. So that tells you how much in an ideal world they want Dante Johnson out there. He played 96% of the snaps. And so what happens there is they go, and listen, my favorite clip of the entire game outside of, the biggest play of the game that we'll talk about here is when they showed Adams getting double coverage, it was double covered in like the most double coveragey way that you can possibly have, where it's literally like 2 guys bracketing him on either side. This wasn't like, I got him early, you get him late, pass off situation. This is like, we're just putting 2 guys on him. That was my favorite, because it was like Dante Johnson and the safety, whether it was, whomever that was back there.
Jimmy Ward.
I think it was Jimmy Ward. Yeah. I thought it might be Tart, but yeah, you're right. It was Jimmy Ward. It's like, okay, no, we have to, for this one instance, have a guy play man-to-man coverage. And it was Josh Norman for one snap, like one of his 2 snaps all game, right? And so Adams ends up going under because he doesn't catch that pass. The 49ers were going to get the ball back because of that pass, like all of that stuff, right? And so we end up cashing the under on Adams, which was like kind of a miracle. I had people in the comment section, if you will, already chalking that up. But it was a Rodgers choke, right? It was a Rodgers choke.
Yeah.
And you look at the box score and it's like, speaking of, props that we won, right? Over 3.5 receptions to Aaron Jones, because that's what Rodgers does in these playoff games, right? He looks to Adams, he looks to Jones, and he has no faith in anybody else. And for whatever reason, in the first quarter, they have a guy named Daphne out there, who last I heard of a Daphne, she was marrying Niles on Frasier. He's out there. I don't know. He's out from Aaron Rodgers, and it's like, I haven't seen this guy all year, right? And like even some of the other reliable-ish guys weren't even getting that much in the way of targets from Rodgers, right?
Lazard got what, like 1 target maybe?
Something like that. But like you look at the box score and it's literally like there's 2 lines. It's just from a yardage standpoint, it's like Adams, Jones, and that's it. And so this assumption that just because Aaron Rodgers is playing at Lambeau Field and they had the week off and all of that sort of thing, it's like, why are we positive that the guy who's pushing 40 years old is going to love playing in the cold when he hasn't played in the cold all season long, right? Like there wasn't much in the way of cold weather games, right? Against Minnesota. Yep. Like I watched that Minnesota game with, I can't even remember who the quarterback was, Sean Mannion for Minnesota. And it was like, the Packers didn't light up Minnesota on that Sunday night until they got like 5 possessions, because Sean Mannion and the Vikings offense had basically quit on the season already. And so I'm just looking at this going like, what's the assumption that like they're just going to go up and down the field? Like, people were canceling that game after Rodgers took them down the field in that first drive, right? But like the 49ers are allowed to make defensive adjustments. Like DeMeco Ryans was incredible, right? And whether that defensive adjustment is like like the Will Smith defense from Fresh Prince, where it's just like put every player on that guy and like have somebody else beat you. Look at the box score. Nobody else was able to beat them. And again, you know, as much as they've sort of ripped Rodgers here, it's like, yeah, maybe the rest of the guys just aren't good enough, especially when things slow down. The catches become a lot more difficult. Obviously, we saw a fumble from, I believe it was Mercedes Lewis early on in the game. I might be wrong on that.
It was.
But like, yeah. And so, you know, you go, okay, like it's really tough conditions to play. And so, you know, we talked about like Rodgers not going to be able to throw the ball downfield. Speaking of inactives, right? Marcus Valdez-Scantling not being active for that game takes away one of those deep threats on the assumption that Rodgers was even going to be able to throw the ball that far down the field accurately. Obviously, he can throw it down the field, but whether he was going to be able to have that same Rodgers pinpoint accuracy where you were just sitting there going like, this guy's outrageous, right? He is outrageous because he can do it. It just becomes a lot more difficult. And if Jimmy G is never going to have to throw the football, then the 49ers are going to be in this game. And all it would have taken was the Packers maybe getting that field goal at the end of the first half, when obviously things turned super quick in a bad way for the 49ers. But they got a second life after Jimmy throws the interception. Rodgers hits Jones on that broken play. He's wide open down the field. No pinpoint accuracy necessary from Rodgers on that one. But they get the sort of game-saving, if you will, tackle. And then they get the block on the field goal, which, of course, goes back to special teams here. And I got to give credit. You know, we burn, you know, we like to light up some, you know, announcers and some of the mainstream media guys out there. But like, I was like, wow, they're really talking a lot about the special teams before this game starts. And I thought it was, I actually, you know, again, said to Emily, I was like, it's really bad. It's a kind of a bad sign for the 49ers where they come into a game and they're like, we actually have the special teams advantage in this game. Like they were talking about it in a way where like, we never have the special teams advantage, but we actually do in this game. And it's like, that's a bad sign for the 49ers, but it's a really bad sign for the Packers, where this team who has bad special teams actually knows that they have the advantage against the Packers. And of course, that's the thing that ended up turning this game.
Yeah, there was a quote from, like, didn't Aikman say it on the broadcast that LaFleur said, yeah, like LaFleur said, hopefully our special teams doesn't mess this up for us, right? Which is like, why would you say that first off?
Crazy, right? Like no one ever talks about special teams, and like he's worried that they're going to mess it up, and the 49ers are excited because they don't have the worst special teams for a change. Like it's so bizarre. And but that's the thing.
They showed, but they also showed the clip post game of Shanahan in the locker room giving out the game ball, and he was like, "We talked about it all week. We talked about it all week, and you guys all bought in that special teams could make the difference in this game." And I was like, "Holy jeez, like this is really weird, right?" Like they did talk about it all week, like, and the whole team's like, "Yeah," and they gave my guy the game ball that got the block on the punt, and I was just like, "Hey, that's football,
isn't that
right?" Like we focus in. But we focus in so much on quarterbacks, and everything is about quarterbacks. Even after that game ends, they're interviewing Jimmy Garoppolo, and it's like, okay, cool, whatever. But, you know, in the whole debate about the overtime rules and all that, I saw Jeff Saturday on ESPN, and he was like, you know, the defense is allowed to make a play, right? Yep. So, like, the fact that the overtime rules are the overtime rules, whatever, that doesn't mean the defense can't get a stop. And it's the same thing in this game. The special teams is like, you might as well just eliminate all special teams, right? Remove the kickers, remove the punters, take them out of the whole game if special teams isn't allowed to win you a game. And that's what we saw there. And I thought, you know, hey, that's pretty cool. I'm not just saying that as a Niners fan because, hey, yeah, cool, won money. Hey, that's my team. Cool, whatever. I think they're going to get blown out next week, but that's a story for another day. But it's like... But my point is, right, you're allowed to have these moments where your special teams players come up and make big plays. And I thought that was really, 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 really big.
And honestly, and again, I mentioned sort of the escape to fandom for that Bills Chiefs game. This wasn't an escape to fandom. This was purely money driven. I haven't celebrated a play like I did that block punt in years.
Yeah.
Now, part of that is I
insanity.
often find myself watching these games, and a lot of times, 11 o'clock at night, and maybe, somebody's asleep, or maybe the cat's asleep, and I don't want to send the cat through the roof, by jumping up after a play. This one, it was no holds barred. I don't care, man. Like I am running around the house. I am, running upstairs going, you won't believe what happened. Like a full on, like have not had a reaction. You made the greatest point. Like the Kawhi shot was the last time that you had like that type of a reaction to a play, because, when, once that game becomes, it's a tie game now, you like the cover, which I had gotten deep into the weeds, +6 on that game. Right. I got in live at halftime. I'm live in the, halftime on the money line at +400, like just way deep. I tweeted it out like at halftime, I'm so deep into this. We've gotten to a point where like the only response to this is like, that's too much money to have riding on this game for a game that, we're down 7-0, right? Like the side that I needed in this game. And so, like it was entirely financially driven, but like I have not celebrated like that in a really, really long time, because the cat was flying across the room on it. Luckily the wife was upstairs reading before going to bed, so it wasn't a full on like wake her up type of a situation. So I didn't get in trouble from that standpoint. So, but that's like you mentioned like that's the cool part about football, right? And like again, you walk into a divisional weekend, you're like, you're going to bet against Aaron Rodgers, you're going to bet against Tom Brady. You're going to bet against Patrick Mahomes? How could you, right? And you mentioned the defense thing, and like we are one like fundamental defense thing away, from the Bills with that 13 seconds left. And again, like we talked about the overtime rules, I don't care. Like stop them in that 13 seconds. Like why are you playing a no out of bounds defense when the other team has timeouts? Like they're allowed, you let them go out of bounds. Like you can't exchange those timeouts for like a goodie at the counter on your way out. Like you're at the state fair, right? Like you just let them keep their timeouts. And if they want to go out of bounds, they can go out of bounds, because that's going to take time off the clock too. And so like, defense matters, special teams matters. And that's what's so cool about football. Like, you and I love basketball, right? Hockey, all of these other sports too. But like, there's no other sport where there's like it was called the dark corners, where it's like, well, how'd you win the game? It's like, honestly, we gave up a touchdown on the first drive. We held him. We blocked a field goal. We held him to one other field goal the rest of the way. It started snowing. Things got a little crazy. We got a field goal. Then we blocked a punt. And then our wide receiver carried the ball on 3rd and 7. And we got a first down.
We've got a long way without mentioning Debo.
For sure, but like like he's on the team. Like we already know he exists. I'm sort of saying like the sort of ins and outs, right? Where it's like, and our kicker, who was like, kind of a borderline legendary kicker for the Bears, and they let him go because he was too old, and that was like 5 years ago, and now he's striping 40+ yarders in the snow, and it's like, we won 13-10, and it's like, wow, like that, that's incredible. It's like, we didn't really do anything in the way that people expected us to do it. And like, that's the fun part about football, right? And as long as like people can get out of the way as far as rules and taunting BS and like coaches, making egregious mistakes, but most importantly, the officiating, like that's why we love it. That's why we come back, because it's so fun to bet on. It's so fun to watch. And it's just like, you just never know how these games are going to go. And that's what you got to love about football, man.
I agree. And like, the part where people keep talking about, were these games actually good games or just good endings? And I'm kind of like, no, like I enjoy defense. I enjoy the chess match of, okay, this is working for this team. What is the counter to that? And you mentioned the Niners giving up that touchdown, and the Packers went right down the field. And it was almost as if the Niners were like, okay, let's see what they're going to do. And then now we're going to do this. And it was just perfect. And even on that last play, the last chance that Rodgers had, where he threw it up into double coverage and to Devontae Adams, like they showed it, and they did a good job on the broadcast showing like the Niners just decoying what they were doing on defense there. And Rodgers thinks he has one-on-one, or maybe he doesn't care, and he's just throwing it up anyways, right? And it's like a great defensive play call by DeMeco Ryans. And it's just like, hey, that's all part of the game as well. Niners win, Niners cover. all the cash being made. You mentioned the rollover into next week. We'll get to next week in a bit. But there's still one more game that we'd like to go over here, which is the Bengals and the Titans. And to me, I'm going to say this was the best lesson that I've had so far in terms of, you talk about betting on the jerseys and the players as opposed to betting on the numbers. Because all we talked about on Friday was, I like the Titans. I thought, hey, Titans to win by 2.5, cool. I'd be in on that. And you mentioned as soon as it makes the crossover, the key number of 3 into 3.5, you just have to bet the Bengals just because of probabilities. And I couldn't help but think about those exact words as I'm watching that fourth quarter play out. And now it's a math game, right? Because you're just like, well, what's the probability of how this game is going to end right now? And it was just the perfect thing, because you're sitting there as a Bengals fan, a Bengals bettor, at plus 3.5, being like, yeah, cool. Do whatever you're going to do here, Titans. This is playing out perfectly. You got Tannehill. You're going to settle for a field goal. Like, we all seen how this was going to play out. It was perfect. And those are the things that I hope that there are people who are listening week in, week out, and appreciating the value in that explanation, right? Because that part of it is so key. The difference between betting the number as opposed to the team. I mean, salute to you. Well, because I'm saying, like, I'm sitting here learning. That, right? And it was great to watch in real time.
Yeah. So fundamentally, I'll put it this way, right? And we don't say this enough. When it comes to sports betting, whether you're new, old, medium, whatever, right? Like, I've been doing this a really long time. It took me a really long time to learn it. The cool thing about the era that we are in now is that there are way more, as in like a infinite multiple amount of resources right now if you're learning about sports betting. Problem is 99.9 of them are absolute garbage. All right. And so the reason that we do this is because we're trying to be that 0.5%. And what we don't say enough, and this is sort of a mistake on our part, is reminding people that as soon as you start putting a value on something, right? In this case, obviously, it's sports teams and whether they're going to win or lose, right? You're putting a value, a price tag on the Titans money line, for example, or the Cincinnati money line, or a point spread. The minute you start doing that, then yes, it becomes about math. It becomes about probabilities, not necessarily, okay, who's going to win, who's going to lose, and like the X's and O's, because the reason I bring that up is because watching these games and knowing these teams is important as well. And so when you mention the idea of like the Titans are going to win this game by 3 points, and like, are they, sort of capable, if you will, of winning it by more than 3, sort of scoring a touchdown late when that game is tied, or is Mike Vrabel super content with kicking a field goal late in that game, right? Where you're sitting there, you're watching it, and like, be honest, like you sort of mentioned it, but like, you're not worried about the Titans scoring a touchdown when it's 16-16. You and I are both like, Mike Vrabel is absolutely fine with winning this game by 3 points. And because Ryan Tannehill throws an interception and the Bengals are able to, have Joe Burrow hit that pass to Chase and they win the game by a field goal, doesn't change the fact that that game in a Titans victory or a potential Titans victory was going to be a 3-point game so much of the time, right? So much of the time. And it's, like, we can talk about like the 2-point conversion decision early on. I'm on the fence on that one, right? Like, you try to get as many points as possible. My only argument for it would be you paying Derrick Henry that much money. You're supposed to get 1 yard. Like, that's what he's there for, right? It's the Ezekiel Elliott thing, where anytime the Cowboys don't go for it on 4th and 1, you go, so what's Zeke Elliott on the field for? What's he getting paid for, right? And so, there's a 3rd down and 4th down. Like, people are ripping Vrabel because like the play calling on 3rd and 4th down. But again, like, the play calls on the 3rd and 4th down were Ryan Tannehill keep, who is a totally mobile quarterback. Like, this isn't just some guy off the street or whatever. We obviously have Derrick Henry on the field as the decoy. Like, again, that's part of his purpose as well. If Ryan Tannehill keeps it, gets the yard, it's a genius play call. And then on 4th down, if they do anything but run Derrick Henry on 4th and 1, the internet absolutely just let lights on fire. Music City burns to the ground, right? Mm-hmm. And so, like, maybe you do the opposite order where you try Derrick Henry on 3rd and 1, and then you try Tannehill on 4th. But like, what did you want there? Did you want the ball in Ryan Tannehill's hands throwing the football? Well, he threw his first pass for an interception, and he threw his last pass for an interception, and he threw one in between, right? 3 interceptions. So, like, what do you want from Vrabel in that situation, right? But we know Vrabel. We know that he's, he knows the rules. So we know that he's, taking timeouts at the end of the first half. But we also know that he's going to play this game in as conservative a way as possible, with the exception of going for 2 in that instance, which is what sort of threw people for a loop. It's like, oh my God, like this guy who, like, we expect a certain level of decision making or a certain, kind of decision making. Oh man, he went for 2 to try to make it a 2-point game instead of a 1-point game. It's the first half. So somebody was going to score, right? Like the Bengals were going to score another point at some point. Like this idea that game was going to end 7-6 seems a little bit ridiculous to me. But yeah, in the end, it ends up costing them because they aren't leading by 1 point. It isn't 14-13 at the end of that game. It's 13-13. But if it was 14-13, guess who would have been in pretty good shape? We would have been, because we had those points, right? And that's the thing. I would have been interested in the Titans the next week as, underdogs at home against either the Bills or the Chiefs. That would have been interesting for me because, again, Vrabel plays the game close to the vest. He is going to play that game not to get blown out. He is going to play that game to have a chance to win it at the end. That's what that's what he was bred to do from Belichick and the Patriot way, if you will, right? He wasn't bred for the 2007 Patriots. He was bred by the 2002, 2003 style Patriots, right? Those teams that would go to the Super Bowl and either win or win against as a favorite, but they wouldn't even cover as a favorite, right? Like they obviously won the first one as an underdog to the Rams, but then didn't cover in some of those other Super Bowls. And so the point is like, when it becomes a math proposition, like you're not necessarily going to win it all the time, but when we can get 3.5 points because the market decided home field means more in the playoffs, as if teams in the NFL are trying harder in the playoffs, right? Like, they're probably more focused on a sort of week-to-week basis than we see in the NFL. But like once you're out on the field in week 7, like you're trying pretty hard in the NFL. Or this idea that Derrick Henry with a plate in his foot is going to be, again, not necessarily bad or good, but is he going to be better than the Titans' run game without? And we you and I put together the stats about Henry before and the guys replacing Henry after. And then you watch Dante Foreman get 4 touches in that game. And he cracks a big one that like could have easily been a touchdown, but he's got, you look at the box score and it's like 4 for 60 for him and then like 20 for 60 for Henry. And it's like, you have to play Henry. All right. Obviously, it's not like you'd be like, oh, you're healthy or, you're able to play. Sorry, you can't play. Like people would be up in arms about that too. But like they had to use the fresher guys more than they did. Right. But they got sort of wrapped up in the name brand that is Derrick Henry. And so did the market. And that's why we went from 2.5 to 3.5. And you can't tell me that home field or the rest advantage or any of those things mattered in a game that, again, if you're sitting on -2.5, then I'm not saying it's a bad beat necessarily, but you were certainly in it as the Titans are driving it down the field there to get that field goal. But at +3.5, we're laughing, man. Like we're like, there is a very small chance that the Titans are going to score a touchdown here. Now, it just happened to be a bonus, if you will, that the Bengals got the ball back and they won the game. We didn't have any money line in that game, right? We weren't having that consideration. I still think it was a kind of, I don't say a fluke necessarily, but it was really fortunate that the Bengals won that game in the end. They kind of blew that lead late in that game, obviously, to have that get a little dicey for them, considering they were leading throughout that game. But like, okay, fine, Bengals win, good for them. But for us at +3.5, like, that's just a bet that you have to make. Like, I'm sorry, like people telling you all week because they have -2.5 that you should bet -3.5. That's kind of unacceptable to me, right? Like that's just not the same thing, right? That's telling me, for sure. I bought something at $10 and I'm telling you to buy it at $11. Like that doesn't really add up for me as far as good, solid, strong advice. I'm sorry, that's just how I feel.
No, I hear you, man, and I totally agree. It's just a lesson in betting the number as much if not more, then you're betting the team, and totally makes sense. I want to get more so into next week's stuff. But before we do that, I just need a reminder to ask all of you if you have checked out Cash Grab. Cash Grab is the DRF Sports all-new free-to-play sports prediction game where you can win real money. It's available to every sports fan in the App Store and the Google Play Store. Win real cash prizes every day, as well as a chance to win big money jackpots. All you have to do is download the free DRF Cash Grab app, create an account, start predicting. Who will win the first quarter? How many touchdowns will Patty Mahomes score? Will he score an OT a touchdown? He will. That's the lesson here. That's the lesson. But answering questions like these can end in you making real money. So download the DRF Cash Grab app now and win big. So we are now into the conference championships. And here's the thing. Okay. We have the Chiefs. Let's start here. Let's go in order of the games here, right? So you have Bengals and Chiefs. Chiefs are 7-point favorites. I'm going to look at this game and I'm going to be honest. I feel like by the time this game plays, it will be up to 7.5. Just because I feel like people are going to be just giddy and living off the life of the Chiefs and just watching them dominate. And I get all that. And I'm going to be sitting here waiting for it to get to that number so I can take the Bengals in just the backdoor cover potential where they're going to be just hanging around. And I'm not saying that they don't have a chance to win this game. I'm just saying that I think the 7 points is a lot. I mean, we'll get into that. I don't even, sorry. I'm going to pause because I don't even want to get too far into it because I'm just looking at the opening lines right now. And I kind of want to get your thoughts on the opening lines. We'll deep dive into this on Friday as we always do.
Of course.
But I'm just too hyped right now.
You come to me on the Tuesday for the sort of market line, right? Like, okay, what should this point spread be? What is this point spread, et cetera, right? Like we don't have a, lean necessarily or a side that we're necessarily looking to bet on here. Obviously point spread from that standpoint. There was some 6.5s that sort of made a cameo appearance, which I think is actually kind of low-key bad bookmaking. Like who wasn't going to bet on the Chiefs at under a touchdown after that performance on Saturday, right? Like the number had to be 7. My number is 6.7, right? So I'm like right in the middle. Obviously, if I was a bookmaker, I would start at 7 and sort of go, okay, you want the Bengals at +7, and take me down to 6.5? Okay, I bet you don't, right? Like I bet you're not going to do that. So I would have always started at 7, and not that 6.5 was necessarily widely available, but by and large on Monday you could pay -115, closer to -120 for -6.5, which again around 7, key number, right? I don't hate your strategy necessarily if you like the Bengals waiting on this because a lot of people are going to like the Chiefs. I'll be interested to see where if this comes off of 7 at any point. The interesting one on this was the total was opened at 50.5 and shot up pretty quickly to 53. I was looking at it. I had it all lined up in the queue and I was like, no, let's just give this a minute. And then it went to 54.5 on Monday. So I'm out on the total here because the Bills game, Bills Chiefs was 53.5, 54, 54.5 by the time that game kicked off. And the Bills have a defense that they have built in theory to try to stop the Kansas City Chiefs. Now, nobody stops the Kansas City Chiefs, but you can make the case that they slowed down the Chiefs to the point where that was at least a reasonable football game through 3.5 quarters. Then, obviously, things got mega weird. But, I don't think the Bengals are necessarily there yet from a defensive standpoint, right? And I'm not saying the Bengals can't run and gun with the Chiefs. We saw this matchup, 4 or 5 weeks ago, right?
Are they ready for prime time?
Yeah. And it was an absolute shootout. And of course the Bengals won that game at home with quite a significant comeback. And so I go, okay, the 7 makes total sense to me. The total is up to 54.5. That total always had to be higher than the total was for the Bills game, even if you're sort of going, well, the Bills offense is better than the Bengals offense. I don't know that necessarily matters, right? Because everything's going to gravitate to what the Chiefs do offensively, right? If the Chiefs score 40 points, think the Bengals are probably going to score 20 points. Like the Steelers scored 20, whatever it was, 17 something points, 21 points or something like that in that first game. Like they actually ended up scoring points because the Chiefs scored so many points that the defense ceased to kind of care late in that game. So, you know what I mean? Like, so like that's where you sort of have to think of the total from a game, situation standpoint here. So, flat 7. Total's out of reach at this point for me to like be looking to, get a bet down on it. I'm always going to look back at that and go, why didn't I just bet the 53? So that's where we stand with this game. Obviously, we'll talk more about how to bet it on Friday, props, all that kind of
we'll get to all that. And I was just looking at that number and thinking, oh, please go to 7.5 so that I have an easier idea of what I'm going to do. Because if it's at 7, I'm going to be very confused. So I'm waiting to see how this week plays out for sure. And as we look towards the next game, the Niners at the Rams, in a game that we've seen very recently, but the spread is 3.5 for the Rams. What do you think of this line? And I know I kind of said it earlier. I threw a throwaway line. I said I think the Niners are going to get blown out. I'll explain more on Friday. That's and I'll just say this. But I'll just say this. Some of this is all just based off of the fandom being mixed in. And, I take the week to separate that because we're talking about making bets. I'm not making the bets with my heart here. We've noticed this. I've said this openly. I bet against the Niners throughout this whole season, if you've been following along on this pod. So we'll get there on Friday. But in terms of the line at 3.5, what say you there?
Yeah, I'm surprised by this one. I don't agree with this line, and I think we're sort of seeing a correction here, right? I tweeted out on Sunday, I don't know how this isn't a flat 3 and just stays a flat 3. And I'm not saying that means like 49ers are some sort of mortal lock or any of that sort of thing, but like I'm looking at it and it's 3.5. You have to pay for that plus 3.5. I was able to find a minus 105 that I laid into yesterday. And of course that disappeared, within hours, if you will, but like plus 3.5 at minus 115 that's currently, available. It's absolutely something I would do. I don't understand why this game isn't a 3. It's rare that we get the matchup, these two teams or any two teams playing each other twice in January. But here we are, as far as the NFL's new schedule, and week 18 being like January 9th was when these two teams already played. That closed 3.5, right? Once it was determined that Garoppolo was fine, he was going to start in that game, and it wasn't like, we sort of did that, is Trey Lance going to have to play because Jimmy's hurt type of situation. Once everything settled, that game was 3.5. And I understand, you and I talk all the time about the idea of just because this game happens doesn't mean that the line should move all that much. And so that's what, the sports books are sort of attesting to, right? They're going, it was 3.5 then. So it's going to be 3.5 now. And the only change that we're going to make sort of in regards to the 49ers is that instead of minus 110 for plus 3.5, it's going to be minus 115 for plus 3.5. It's going to be minus 120 for plus 3.5. We're going to just change the juice a little bit here. My numbers happen to make this 2.5. Again, that shouldn't come as a surprise to people. I've been on the 49ers as far as a team that I've rated higher than most. That has caused us to anguish against the likes of Colt McCoy this season. But more importantly and more relevantly, especially lately, that has caused us to be profitable a lot more towards the end of this season. And so you can understand why I would be high on the 49ers, why I would make this under a field goal. I just think this number has to be a field goal. I think that's probably where it ends up closing once all the information with regards to the injuries sort of come down throughout the week. Because we watch those games on Saturday night and everybody on the 49ers is hobbling off the field as if for some reason in minus whatever weather and a physical game like that you're supposed to skip off the field without any bumps or bruises whatsoever, right? And like Debo has to miss a few plays and it's like, oh God, is he going to be okay for next week? And Trent Williams, oh no, is he going to be okay for next week, right? We saw that with Bosa, Warner, and even Garoppolo in the previous week. It's like, football's really tough, man. I'd be hobbling off too. I would have a limp after I played in any sort of a football game. So I'm not going to live or die with the idea that these guys by the end of that game were a little sore. They get to play indoors this week. I think that's an interesting, obvious twist as to how do teams perform after playing out in the cold and then they get to come in and play indoors again. That'll be interesting. I think this game ends up closing 3 if you can get plus 3.5 at a decent price, certainly at minus 110, but even minus 115. I think you start there and then you figure out where to go with it after. We'll talk about the math around the money line rollover, the sort of futures bet on the 49ers that we have, or that we've sort of put into play. We can talk about that more on Friday from a mathematical standpoint. As far as the total is concerned, they did the same thing, right? They go, okay, it was 46.5 in that game 3 weeks ago, doing the same thing, 46.5, no change there. And really no reason to have a change from the total from a few weeks back.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just going to look forward to the week and getting more information and be back with you on Friday to break a bunch of that down. We're got to wrap soon just because it's getting a little hectic where I'm at here. But I do want to know what's going on with you and where the people can find the information in between time, because there's a lot of things that you'll be handing out. And I think it's important that people really know where to get the information ASAP before numbers start to change, lines start to move, all that fun stuff. And also you're giving out just free goodies on an every night basis as well in some college basketball stuff. So where can we find that information, my dude?
I appreciate you saying every day. It's almost every day. We had a rough night in college hoops last night, but great news. First of all, at mrussauthentic on Twitter. Great news. I'm actually writing my first college basketball piece for The Score today as we sort of now transition, right? From the depths of 6 and 4 NFL football playoff games. I get to actually write a little futures article this week about college basketball. Going to give out a handful of plays. Last night on Twitter did not go particularly well. Little known rule, once they stop playing football on Monday nights, maybe don't dive headfirst into college basketball on a bigger slate, even though Texas Tech and Kansas was an absolute banger last night. Didn't have a bet on it, but watched it as a fan, and that 2 overtime classic was outstanding. So let's do some plays for tonight. Hopefully they go better than Monday nights did. Fordham plus 13.5 at Dayton. Auburn's at Missouri plus 14.5 in that game. Richmond is at Rhode Island. I like Rhode Island in this game, minus 2.5. Mississippi State at Kentucky. I'm a little worried because Kentucky pretty banged up after that big game against Auburn this past week. My numbers say that Kentucky should be 12-point favorites. The line is 9.5, so I gotta go with Kentucky in that game, even though I think Mississippi State is sneaky good. Not comfortable with that. It is purely a numbers play. Texas and TCU. Look for TCU for the upset tonight. They are plus 2.5-point underdogs against a Texas team who might be finding themselves on my no-bet list after Saturday, where we went 11-9 and 20 plays on Saturday. What a wild ride that was. Nevada and Colorado State. I've got Colorado State minus 7. I should say that's the bet. My numbers have Colorado State as more than a 7-point favorite here. Air Force plus 1.5 at San Jose State. I think Air Force should be favored in that game. And then the big game of the night, Arizona, who has gone way up the Ken Palm ratings over the last few, basically this entire season, from where, we didn't know necessarily what the Wildcats were going to have at the start of the year. Arizona minus 2 at UCLA. The short road favorite is always a dicey proposition here. I think this is a big time game and I'm excited to watch it. Give me Arizona minus the 2 there. So 8 plays tonight. If I have anything to add, I will add it at mrussauthentic on Twitter. As always, tweet everything that I write over at The Score through that as well. So between that and this podcast, you get more than enough action. I always say there is nobody on the planet who gives out more picks, more free picks, who also hits them at better than 55% than we do on this show. A lot of people talk sports betting on their podcast and they give out 1 or 2 picks. Not us. We are slinging them from deep.
It's true. It's very true. And as I like to say all the time, I'm like, you can listen, you can join the wave, you can join the fun. And if you don't, I'm cool sitting back because that's what the money's for. And it's been a profitable playoff so far. So hopefully you're along for the ride with us because there's only a couple more weeks left to do this in terms of NFL betting. And then we're into college basketball to get more winners there as well, building up towards March Madness. But either way, make sure that you're with us here. Can
I make a request? Can we do an Olympics podcast? Can we do some Olympics betting this February?
I mean, more action. You can never really talk me out of more action. I'm here for that. We can figure that out. We'll figure that out.
Olympics.
Okay, we will figure that out. All right. In the meantime, though, thank you for joining us here on the pod again. Look forward to talking to you, catching up at the end of the week, my dude.
Thanks, brother. Always a pleasure.
Thanks to Matt for coming on the pod. And if you want to follow me online, you can do so on Instagram at Sheldon Alexander and on Twitter at Shell Alexander. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the DRF Sports Podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Also rate us, review us, like us, all that other fun stuff. But for more from this new project from DRF Sports, just a little reminder, if you're unfamiliar with the letters DRF, stands for Daily Racing Forum, which has been around for over 100 years, giving you all of the horse racing information, data, and analysis. But now we've taken over the entire sports world. So if you want coverage on every football game, as well as the NBA, MLB, college sports, and more, head to drf.com/sports for all of the details and insights, as the site has all of the data on every game, including offensive and defensive stats, betting angles, line movements, key injuries, team stats, and more. The DRF data is what powers our power trends. So if you want to see which trends our analysts have selected, follow us on Instagram and on Twitter. If you want access to all of the raw data, drf.com/sports. That's where you can find the usual previews as we deep dive into the games. And of course, got you covered on this podcast. However you want your betting information, we've got you covered. Again, my name is Sheldon Alexander. We do this podcast twice a week on Tuesdays and on Fridays. That's all I got for now. But until next time, see ya.
Thanks for listening to the DRF Sports Podcast. Please subscribe, rate, and review the show. For more sports betting advice, go to drf.com/sports and follow on Twitter at DRF_sports.